Now, having a debate on all this is almost impossible now, particularly on the ABC. I mean, when the ABC's Q&A program discussed The Voice in June, not one of the 7 people talking on its panel was against it. Not one. Yesterday on the ABC Insider program, not one of the 4 people on that panel was against it either. They're not chosen. If you're against, you're not chosen. Maybe you don't dare speak. But here on Sky News, we do believe in debate. So I have asked Sky News host Chris Kenny onto the show because he is for The Voice. He was on the previous government's Indigenous Voice Senior Advisory Group. Chris Kenny, thank you so much for your time, mate. I really appreciate the chance to have a debate.
Pleasure,
but first,
Andrew.
tell me what I don't get. You know, we already have a Council of Peaks advising the government. They represent 70 top Aboriginal organisations. We already have more than 30 big land councils having some control over vast parts of the country. We also have 11 federal politicians who identify as Aboriginal. That's 5% of politicians, when Aborigines just make up 3.3% of the public. So why, on top of all that and all the other Aboriginal groups there are, do we need an Aboriginal-only advisory parliament and written into the Constitution?
Well, for starters, Andrew, none of that is working. We're not redressing Aboriginal disadvantage in this country, so doing the same as we've always done isn't going to work. Secondly, of course, Indigenous Australians are not even mentioned in our Constitution, and there's a broad consensus across the country and all political parties that we should have Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. And Indigenous Australians have said this is the way they want to be recognised in the Constitution, not through some symbolic or patronising mention, but through something practical that could help. Because in this country in 1967, we had an overwhelming support across the country for a change to our Constitution that allowed the federal government to make special laws for Indigenous Australians. We all agreed at the time this was useful because we want to overcome Indigenous disadvantage. But we have no mechanism for those Indigenous Australians to actually have their say, tell us what they think will help redress health outcomes or employment outcomes or domestic violence in remote communities. So I think it makes sense if we have Canberra able to make special laws, then we ought to allow those people to have a say. It's a fair go.
Well, it's not. It's more than a fair go. Aborigines already make up a higher percentage of our MPs than they do of the public. So, you know, we're actually asking
I don't think that's relevant, Andrew. I don't
not
think
just
the
the vote, but also a separate parliament.
No, it's not a separate parliament. It's an advisory body. Very clearly, make representations. The government can ignore anything they want to say. But the point is, it's great that there's some Indigenous parliamentarians now, and more now than ever before. Now, some of them we respect and admire, like Jacinta Price or perhaps Pat Dodson, but others are Lydia Thorpe. She's there today basically thumbing her nose at her oath to the Senate. So I don't think the Indigenous background of people in Parliament is what counts. We don't think that Ed Husic is there to represent Muslim Australians or that Josh Frydenberg was there to represent Jewish Australians. They're there to represent their parties and their electorates and their constituents. And I think we need a way for broader...
Isn't that our future, Chris, where we represent people regardless of their race? Now you want people, you say, well, those Aboriginal parliamentarians, we can't, you know, they don't really count because they don't represent a race. You do want people to represent a race. I think that is such a retrograde step.
I don't. Well, actually, they're representing indigeneity, which is slightly different from race because they were the original owners, they're the descendants. They've inherited certain rights that our High Court has handed down and our Parliament has recognised, for instance, native title rights. And the other point, as I said, is that the federal government has special powers to make laws for them.
I don't quarrel with that. I don't quarrel with native title rights, OK?
Sure.
Properly administrated. I don't. But the point is, I'm Indigenous. People who've been here 200 years are Indigenous. It is actually race. We're saying this group of people are more Indigenous because of their race. I mean, some of them have some of them have maybe one great-great-grandfather, but how does that make them so much more Indigenous than anyone else? It sets up to me a false dichotomy. It stresses as race as the primary difference between us, which I think is false, wrong and dangerous.
Well, let me talk about three ways that there is a difference. Two are sort of legalistic and one, if you like, is practical. And that is, firstly, Indigenous Australians, because of the Mabo decision and native title laws and the like, do have special rights to parts of this country. Secondly, because of that 1967 referendum, the federal government has special powers to be able to pass laws about Indigenous people, yet it doesn't get any advice from them. And the third point, which is more practical, which is more human, if you like. Just let me finish the third point. The third point, and the third point is
a whole group of organisations to give advice.
The third point, Andrew, is that unquestionably Indigenous Australians are the most disadvantaged people in this country. Now, there's all sorts of complex reasons for that, but it is a national shame that their life expectancy is shorter. They're much less likely to finish school, to get an education, to get a job. And we all want that. You, me, everybody's in this for the same reasons. And I believe that requires some special attention from government.
I don't understand. Well, that is actually happening mostly. It's not all Aborigines. It's particularly Aborigines living in the most, not quite traditional ways. There's not much traditional culture left, but out bush, where there's more Aboriginal control, particularly through land councils, where there's more consultations, all that kind of stuff. It's not lack of consultation that is keeping them poor. It's not that.
It's not lack of goodwill.
Just yet another consultative group will not change it.
It's not a lack of goodwill, and it's not a lack of funding.
And not living near jobs.
Look, as you know, though, Andrew, the disadvantage is not just in remote communities. It's on the fringes of regional towns. It's in the suburbs of our capital cities. There are different issues in different areas. We all agree we need to try and improve it, try and eradicate that disadvantage. And I don't think there has ever been a proper representative body. You talk about all these other organisations. They're often run by the so-called elites that people want to get rid of. ATSIC was a funding organisation that got corrupted by channeling out money. There'll be no money handed out by this body, just ideas. It will deal in ideas and opinions and advice to Parliament, not doling out money the way
opinions did. We've got them. We've had them. The Council of the Peaks, we've got them.
Well, we obviously haven't got the right ones because it ain't working.
Now you say it won't have real power, it won't be funding. How do you know that? The government says, oh, look, it's said before, it's just going to be an advisory parliament, just like you said earlier. Where's the guarantee that it's not going to have real power? Where's the guarantee that it won't be funding? Because that is certainly not in the wording that the Prime Minister says he actually wants to put in the Constitution. There is no such guarantee.
There is in that wording for the Constitution when it comes to power. It says that the voice can make representations. The exact wording, make representations to Parliament or to the government. That's all.
So you know what
and then point three says the Parliament can do whatever it likes, form it in whatever way it likes.
So people know what you're talking about here. The words actually say the Parliament shall have the power to make laws with respect to the composition, functions, powers and procedures of this Aboriginal voice. So Parliament can give this voice powers and functions. And we're not told what. A future Parliament could say, well, listen, we're going to give you spending powers. We could give you the function of ruling particular parts of Australia. You've got no way of knowing what a future Parliament, what powers and functions it will give to this voice. It is not in the proposal that the government says.
The wording you read there is point 3 of the wording, and that actually gives everyone the guarantee, the comfort that Parliament will be supreme, that Parliament can change, reform the voice in any way it sees fit. The clause above that, clause 2,
more power. That's what I'm saying.
The clause above that, as you know, Andrew, says that it will be the power it will have under the Constitution is to make representations. That's all. It can't veto. It can't make decisions. It's not a third chamber. It can just make representations to government. Governments can ignore it if they like.
I know that's what you want. I know that's what you want.
That's what it says.
Clause 3 does not say it will only be advisory and will never have powers or spending functions. It actually says Parliament can give it exactly those powers. It can have powers with respect to the functions. It can make laws with respect to the functions and the powers of this Aboriginal voice. And already yesterday on Insiders, you had an Aboriginal national editor of the Aboriginal editor of the ABC, saying, yes, we want real power. We want this body to be feared.
I showed that in my show at 5 o'clock, Andrew. It's shocking. There's going to be extremists and activists who want more in this debate, but they shouldn't distract us from what mainstream sensible people want. Now, the exact wording of the constitutional changes here has been supported by former High Court judges, no less, and we'll let the constitutional lawyers sort that out.
Yeah, well, I don't trust anyone here, mate. It's very easy for some of these judges to, pose as the great and the good. But the point is, point 3 of what Albanese himself says he wants to put in the Constitution gives a future Parliament the right to devolve powers and procedures to this and functions to this Aboriginal voice. You don't know what those powers and functions could be. I don't know. Nobody knows. And I think once you say Aborigines are so different, they should have their own parliament in the Constitution because they're so different from any other race, you have conceded that argument for some sovereignty. And that would include real power. You can't just fob people off with beads, blankets and just an advisory role.
No one is saying that Aboriginal people are so different. What we're saying is that there's disadvantage and there's certain rights, and the government has powers to make laws over Aboriginal people, yet has no obligation to even take their advice. This would ensure that the government has to take their advice and take it or leave it.
Chris Kenny, I love that debate. You've made some good points. I hope I've made some good points. Let the viewers decide. Why doesn't the ABC have debates like this? Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Absolutely, Andrew. A pleasure.
I hope you found that debate useful, informative, and you might want to ask why our national broadcaster, the ABC, refuses to have them.